It looks like the rebel hat. All right. So it's been a while. Had to be away a couple of weeks, and then VBS last week, and so we're back here. I've got to be gone again. I leave tomorrow. I've got a wedding in the mountains, so we'll get, hopefully, at least finish chapter 10, and that way we can kind of hit a decent stopping spot. We didn't this last time. We're in the middle of a story, and I even had to go back through as I was sitting down to study and just remind myself where in the world we were, because it's been a month or so since I've spent some time looking at it on an in-depth basis. So where we are, chapters 9 and 10 are this unit, and they are about Jehu becoming the king, God anointing him. So God anoints him king over the northern tribes of Israel. And his job is to wipe out the house of Ahab, which was prophesied many times at the end of 1 Kings, you remember. So now he's anointed, and he goes through this process. And we see his anointing and kind of his acceptance among the military leaders. And then he begins to execute punishment on the house of Ahab and other people. So he kills Joram, who is the king of the northern tribes. He also kills the king of the southern tribes as well in chapter 9. And then he takes the body of Ahab's, either his grandson or his great-great-grandson, and he throws that body on Naboth's vineyard. And so there's that cruel irony, but also that justice of the blood that Ahab and Jezebel shed with Naboth, and now that blood is being returned on their own head, literally, on that land. And so then at the end of chapter 9, he executes Jezebel, who is still alive after Ahab has died, and she, in typical Jezebel fashion, is defiant to the end. And she meets a very ugly end. She's thrown out of a window at the palace and she dies, but then dogs eat her in the process, and no one can tell. And that's part of the prophecy that Elijah gave, and so that was to be expected. Then when we came into chapter 10, we're introduced in 10:1 to the 70 sons, 70 of Ahab's sons. And we talked about how it is possible that this has reference to literally 70 sons, but it's also possible that sons in Hebrew is a very elastic term. Could be grandsons. It could just be basically these 70 sons are kind of like the line of succession, the people who would be in order to take the throne if something happened. And so he goes and he has them killed, and we talked about the politics. Jehu's playing smart politics. He has the leaders of the city actually kill them so that he can't. And he comes out to the crowd where all the heads of the sons are stacked up, and he says, hey, look, I take it. I killed the king, but look who killed all of the sons. I didn't do this. Now, he worded it in an ambiguous way that kind of implied that's what he wanted, and then when they did it, he hung them out to dry. Or maybe not hung out to dry, but he made it look like that this revolution wasn't just one man's thing, that it was everybody that was dissatisfied, and that is shown by their killing of the sons of Jehu, or of Ahab, excuse me. Then let's start reading again in verse 12 of chapter 10. It says, so he set out and went to Samaria, and when he had come to Beth-Eked of the shepherds, Jehu met the relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, and he said, who are you? And they answered, we are the relatives of Ahaziah who have come down to visit the royal princes and the sons of the queen mother. He said, take them alive. And he took them alive and slaughtered them in the pit of Beth-Eked, 42 persons, and he spared none of them. Now, this was a peculiar incident, we said, because he's saying they're relatives of Ahaziah, king of Judah, but they're coming from the north, traveling down to Samaria. Okay? The problem with that is Judah is way south. The question is, why are they all the way up here coming down when they could have just gone up like this? Okay? And so it's somewhat sketchy. You don't really know what's going on. Is this execution justified? I don't know. I really don't know. But it does happen. And it shows that Jehu, and one of the things we said when we introduced Jehu is he's an interesting guy for many reasons. But one of which is he is sanctioned by God to execute judgment on the house of Ahab. But God criticizes him for the extent and the manner in which he did it. Okay? For an example, God will use the nation of, let's say, Babylon, and we'll meet them a little bit later in 2 Kings as they destroy the southern tribes. And God commissions them or uses them to kill the southern tribes of Judah, to take them into captivity. But he also passes judgment on them for the manner in which they did it. Okay? And so even though there's this tendency, God may have pronounced judgment on something, there's this tendency sometimes to take it too far. And there's a passage I had referenced, but I didn't actually give you the reference of where it is found when we're dealing with something like this, and that is in Deuteronomy 25. In Deuteronomy 25, when we think about judgment and punishment, it says in chapter 25 and verse 1, if there is a dispute between men and they come into court and the judge decides between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. You see that? Proportion. There are proportionate responses. Okay? Not everything, and this is something we need to learn about discipline at every level, from the discipline we execute in our homes to every other part of society, that there's proportion to it. Not every transgression, not every crime, so to speak, or breaking of the rule deserves the same level of punishment. Okay? Now, sometimes we say, and I say it, and I sometimes don't qualify it well enough, but that all sins are the same. Yes, that's true to its very great degree. But it's also true if you say it the other way, that not all sins are the same, because some of them aren't. And that has to do with the proportion of the punishment that goes along with it. For an example, you look in the law, there's a very difference in the proportion of punishment meted out to a person who tells a lie to his parents than there is the person who kills another person. Right? And a lot of that has to do with the consequences, the earthly consequences that go on. Now, the text I really want us to see is this next verse in verse 3. It says, 40 stripes may be given him, but no more. Lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother is degraded in your sight. Okay? And so we kind of talked about this principle in the beginning, that when we see the atrocities of World War II and we see the things that went on in the Nuremberg trials, and people, even today as we deal with more modern things, but I want to use the Holocaust because that's a little further from us and people can see that a little bit more clearly than they can some of the things that are going on today. We say, why didn't we just do to them what they did to all these other people? Well, because you end up becoming like them. You cannot condemn them in a court of law for what they've done and then do it to them. You end up becoming like them. And God's, listen to the way this is worded, because it's not the way most people would think it would be worded. Most people would think you don't beat him more times than is necessary, lest he becomes degraded in his own sight. Who is God concerned about as he issues this edict? Not about the person receiving the punishment, but the person giving it. Lest the person being beaten becomes condemned in the sight of the person administering the punishment. There's a point at which punishment goes too far. And I think we have to learn that. Okay? And that we end up degrading people in the process, and that we lessen them in our eyes. And I think, there are a million ways you can dissect this and take this. But, I think about it as a parent and the proportion to which you punish your children. I think most of us are guilty, I know I am, of the punishment was not proportionate to what happened. The goal of disciplining children is to teach them something. But if you go so far as to humiliate them, discipline has left the room. There's a difference between disciplining a child and humiliating them, degrading them in the process. And you have to understand that difference. And it's one of these principles, it's not one of these things where you can say, at this point, the line is crossed. But it's one of those things that you can feel and see, that at this point, a line has been crossed. This is no longer about teaching this child something and administering punishment to them to teach them something. It's about, I'm angry and I'm going to show them. And you take it at the smallest level in our homes and you take it into the largest levels of the nations and what is going on here. And that seems to be the big mistake that Jehu makes. His punishment goes too far. It's more out of spite. It's not about executing God's judgment. It's turning into a personal vendetta. Okay? So, as that continues now, we'll pick up in verse 15 of 2 Kings 10, which is where we left off. It says, and when he departed from there, he met Jehonadab, the son of Rechab, coming to meet him. And he greeted him and said to him, is your heart true to my heart as mine is to yours? So basically, are we on the same page here? Are we allies with one another? And Jehonadab answered, it is. Jehu said, if it is, give me your hand. So he gave him his hand, and Jehu took him up with him into his chariot. And he said, come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. So he had him ride the chariot. And when he came to Samaria, he struck down all that remained of Ahab in Samaria, till he had wiped them out according to the word of the Lord that he spoke to Elijah. And so what we're seeing is the fulfillment of the extermination of the family of Ahab. And we're actually going to see the furthest proportion of that. There's kind of this overlapping between chapters 10 and 11, because in chapters 11 and 12, they're a unit where we talk about Joash, but there's also just kind of some overlay where we're introduced to Joash and we're introduced to Athaliah, who has some connections to Ahab, and she is executed, and thus all of Ahab's family is now out of the picture completely, but also that introduces a whole new different section. So there's kind of some overlap that takes place in chapters 10 and 11. So he has executed, this is over. And now I want to say this about Jehonadab, the son of Rechab. If you look in Jeremiah 35, we don't have the time to look at it now, but in Jeremiah 35, God uses these people of Rechab, his family, as an example of obedience. Rechab basically told his family they were not to drink wine, that they were not to build a house, they were to live in tents and be nomads. And their obedience to that command is contrasted with the disobedience of the people of God to God. And so it's kind of a side note, you see some of those individuals that are spoken of in Jeremiah. So these are Ahab's sons. So the majority of the family is now dead. Jezebel's dead. All the sons are dead. You've got a daughter still alive in the south, but we'll get to her here in just a little while. Now it's about, you remember, when you're talking about the problem of the decline of Israel, it began, they broke off from the kingdom and God gave Jeroboam a chance. He said, if you'll be faithful, I'll establish you. Instead, he set up calf worship. And calf worship became a sin that dominated them. Now, one of the things that characterized the family of Ahab, or Omri, which was his father, who started this dynasty, we're all getting them at the same time, aren't we? Must be. All right. So,
Which county was that? Okay. All right. So Jeroboam introduces calf worship, but the family of Omri, Ahab and his sons, they are notorious because they took it a step further and they introduced Baal worship. Okay? Somebody's a little behind on the message. So they introduced Baal worship. All right? So part of removing Ahab and his influence from Israel is also getting rid of Baal worship. And this is another overlap in chapter 11, because right here we're going to see he ends Baal worship in the north, but in chapter 11 they also end it in the south. And so it's another one of those overlap moments. So let's see what he does here. He has some pretty good sleight of hand. Now this is also finishing Elijah's work. In 1 Kings 18, after that encounter on the mountain, 1 Kings 18:4, do you remember? He took the prophets of Baal and slaughtered them, killed them, okay? So let's see what he does here. Then Jehu assembled all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little, and Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore call to me the prophets of Baal, all the worshipers and the priests. Let none be missing, for I have a great sacrifice to offer to Baal. Whoever is missing shall not live. But Jehu did it with cunning in order to destroy the worshipers of Baal. Now what this most likely looks like is, you remember when we saw way back in 1 Kings chapter 2 when Solomon becomes king, the coronation ceremony, and how God is involved in that coronation ceremony. Okay? And so what Jehu seems to be doing or saying is, this is my coronation ceremony, and I'm going to be a Baal worshiper just like Ahab was. And so I want all of you to come for my, for lack of a better term, inauguration. Okay? This is what I want to happen. And so he invites them there for that reason, and he says, for I have a great sacrifice to offer to Baal. The only catch is, the sacrifice that he's going to offer to Baal are the worshipers of Baal. Okay? He's deceiving them. So, that's what he says at the end of 19. But Jehu did it in cunning in order to destroy the worshipers of Baal. And Jehu ordered, sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal, and they proclaimed it. And Jehu sent throughout all Israel, and the worshipers of Baal came, and no man was left that did not come. And they entered the house of Baal, which had been built by Ahab, 1 Kings 16:32. And the house of Baal was filled from one end to the other. And he said to those in charge of the wardrobe, bring out all the vestments for all the worshipers of Baal, that is, the garments and all the official things. Then Jehu went into the house of Baal with Jehonadab the son of Rechab, and he said, the worshipers of Baal, search and see, there is no servant of the Lord here among you, but only the worshipers of Baal. He doesn't want anybody getting caught in the crossfire. And verse 24, then they went in and offered sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had stationed 80 men outside and said, the man who allows any of those to whom I give into your hands to escape shall forfeit his life. So you're going to execute all of these worshipers, and if anyone gets away, it's a typical thing for military back in that time. You pay for your life if you lose one. So as soon as he had made an end of offering a burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and to the officers, go in and strike them down, let not a man escape. So when they put them to the sword, the guard and the officers cast them out and went to the inner room of the house of Baal. So they went in, they would take one person, they'd kill him, and then they'd just toss his body out, kill the next one, and this is happening on a larger scale. You got 80 people doing it. So it's just a massacre of them in their idolatry, which the law sanctions. Deuteronomy 13. If you go after idolatry, you suffer the death penalty. Verse 26, and he brought out the pillar that was in the house of Baal and burned it. And they demolished the pillar of Baal, and they demolished the house of Baal, and made it a latrine to this day. So, completely destroys it. Matter of fact, archaeologists have still been unable to find it. That doesn't mean that it might not turn up somewhere. Okay? For right now, that may be an indicator, though, of just how thoroughly he destroyed it. But the second thing is he turned it into a latrine. He turned it into a bathroom. And the reason he did that was they have this tendency of rebuilding sacred sites where sacred sites once sat. It happens in Jerusalem, right? The temple will be destroyed, demolished, and leveled. And what do when they come back? They rebuild it on the same site. It's not uncommon to do something like that. So, that's why he turns it into a latrine, because it's now considered unclean, and nobody would consider reusing it. All right? Very briefly then, because I want to finish this section before we're done. It says, "Thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel, and Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, that is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan. And the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done well to the house of Ahab, according to all that was in my heart, your sons to the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." So basically 100 years of time. For a solid 100 years, your sons will reign in Israel, which was the longest period of a dynasty reign in the northern tribes, for his obedience. But, verse 31, Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, of the God of Israel, with all his heart, and he did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, with which he made Israel to sin. And so he did the will of God, but yet he didn't fully. He got rid of Baal worship, but he kept calf worship. And it ended up becoming a problem to him later. All right? We'll stop there because that's the bell, and pick up on verse 32 of chapter 10 and move into 11 and 12 next time.